support forces have systematically cut off all routes into and their children animal food. Families survive on food waste, and half of these populations are children below 18. The situation in Sudan generally is not just a humanitarian crisis. Sudan is the world's largest forced displacement crisis and a man-made famine in the recent history. Yet, the Sudanese agony remains unspoken, especially what's happening in Fasher, which is completely overshadowed by other global conflicts, despite representing of what the legal expert will describe a textbook case of starvation as a weapon of war. Now let's move to introducing our distinguished panel. Today, we will hear from 4 exceptional speakers who will bring different but complementary points of view. We have Mr. Sunusi Adam, who will reflect the situation and the realities of what's happening in Fasher, and reflections that statistics will not be able to capture as an external communication coordinator for the Sudanese emergency response rooms. Then we'll have Professor Martha Bradley, an international humanitarian law specialist from University of Johannesburg. Prof will talk about the legal classification and the framework essential for understanding what protection should apply and what violations are occurring. Dr. Yona Diamond from Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights will examine international response mechanisms and accountability options. And then finally, we have Dr. Henry Itini Harry. I'm sorry if I'm butchering names. So please, when you speak, you can pronounce your name right. Will provide a comparative analysis, helping us to understand what's happening in Fasher while looking at the lens of what's happening in Gaza. Mr. Sanusi Adam will start. Let me introduce him. He's a founding member of a community development organization dedicated to progress, a nonprofit entity promoting peace and social justice in Sudan, currently serving as the director of the National Independent Mechanism for Peace Monitoring and Evaluation. Formerly led operational strategy for Sudan Cash Consortium and served as external communication coordinator for the Localization Coordination Council for the emergency response rooms in Sudan. Additionally, he's consulting as a research assistant for the Small Arms Survey. Mr. Adam, please, may you go ahead and explain to us what's happening on the ground in Fasher?
Thank you so much, Razan. Thank you, distinguished panelists. We all know there are lots of challenges in Fasher, in Darfur in general, but in Fasher. I would like to start by kind of just revisiting the numbers given by Razan on the opening. I mean, the population 1.5 million in Fasher, that was before the war. Recently, last checking we've done through our remaining emergency response rooms in Fasher shows that there's between 30,000 to 40,000 families remaining. That is approximately between 180,000 to 200,000 people still trapped in Fasher. With majority of the population in Fasher exiting towards Tawila, towards Libya, and others towards Dabba. The situation remains, as you all, you can, you've read on the news and recently, like the article by Nicholas Christoph in the New York Times, kind of explaining what is happening in there. There has been a massive wave of assault on Fasher the whole year, I think, and that actually created a situation where access to food and water is being a huge issue. We've seen families reverting to eating whatever they can to just make sure that there is something that they can eat, to an extent that people are eating umbaz, which is a you know, when when you're trying to create oil, they squeeze the nuts, and then the remaining, the shells and stuff, that is the umbas. And usually that's been used to feed cattle to kind of help them reproduce. But for human consumption, there is a limit to uh, how much like your stomach can take. We've seen cases of actually people losing lives to that. The and beside that, it's not that there is no money going in. There's a lot of funds going in, but like there is no access. Previously, there used to be food getting in through independent traders here and there through the emergency response rooms, fetching food from other places. But now that is not the case, and the siege is getting tighter and tighter. We've seen the beginning of this year, families exiting due to the hard living situation, living conditions inside the city. The of course we all know that the all most of the facilities, the health facilities, has been destroyed, and there is no access to them. And even with our 50 volunteers remaining now from the marine response rooms in El Fasher, there is a limit also to what they can do in terms of health services and health when it comes to, you know, treating people. um Last year IPC the like it was IPC 4, and I think by the beginning of this year it was an actual famine, and it's been declared in pockets within the city. And just the lack of access, you know, is creating a even harder condition. There are a lot of organizations that they want to work, but they cannot get access into the city. So in a nutshell, the situation is dire. The remaining people in Fasher, if there's no you know, access to them like really soon, I think we will maybe face a like more death like through due to hunger or also just due to like outbreaks of disease.
Sanosi, allow me to interrupt at one point. I just want our audience to get the whole picture. What's stopping people from leaving Al Fasher currently? So those 30 or 40,000 people, why aren't they leaving Al Fasher?
We don't have this data, but I think majority of Sudanese, they, you know, they're home, so they kind of rather stay. But also we don't know if there's actual routes right now that will determine a safe passage for the remaining people in there to actually get out. We've heard, we've seen on social media that the RSF was calling for people to exit, and they promised to, um, you know,
You safe path.
guarantee like, yeah, access and guarantee passage for them. To what extent this could be trusted or not, that's also, you know, something you know, it might be on people's mind when deciding to leave and to exit, and also where are they going to go. And you know, when we've seen also you know, on social media as well, of, you know, a lot of stories of people not making it, people be getting attacked outside when they try to exit. Also, we've seen people got lost in the desert, and you know, and they were like rescued afterwards, stuff like that. So it's the risk is higher. I mean, it's the risk is high both ways, staying or leaving. But it looks like for the people remaining, it will look like the calculation is that the risk is higher if they actually left.
Yes, this is very important because I have seen reports, especially a recent report by the BBC, that they managed to smuggle like 4 phones for people in Al Fasher. So the testimonies that the BBC got from those people is that when they attempt to leave, this is when they're attacked by the RSF. So technically, there's no options. It's death or death. And you mentioned a very good point is that even the one thing that people now rely on to for surviving, that impasse, is actually leading to more death. So the only thing that they can afford they have at their disposal is the animal.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean there are some
Then
livestocks here and there.
Yona is managing to. I can't hear you.
Yeah, I came in because you are cutting, so but continue. I think your network, there's something about your network, but so I could go on until you manage to come back. I mean there are livestocks here and there, but also it's about access. It's about having funds to actually acquire and purchase these. The American Sponsors has been working. There are tekayas that are also working. There are some that have been shut down. I mean, in general, since the US aid cut, we have seen 4 out of each 5 ERs in northern Darfur and other areas in Sudan is being shut down because just the lack of funding. But despite that, there are those who remain, and there are those who are trying to help and make sure that people at least eat a meal a day or two, depending on their access to funding, and also depending on their access to the people. There are some people who are tracked closer to the army headquarters, and those are hard to reach. But also people remains on pockets within the cities neighborhoods, and those who are somehow getting help and getting assisted. I was on a call, I think 3 months ago, with one of our volunteers in El Fasher, and they were actually talking to me um, from these makeshift shelters that they make. They dig holes in the ground and they kind of try to cover them with iron sheets, and they put some of the dirt over them. So it's that's their life now. It's like in constantly they run to these shelters when there is actual like this bombing or shelling, and they actually also come back out and try to kind of live their life when there is not. I have seen on the video call then children playing. I've seen also children like can't even move. I have seen very skinny looking people. It's clearly they're being hit hard. I mean, it's been 2 years of a siege. So yeah, so the situation is really dire.
SNLC, you mentioned something that it's not just a problem of funding at this point, because even if we have the required funds, there is no way that these commodities will enter into fashion. Is this correct?
I mean, yes, that's very correct. We need actual corridors. We need access for humanitarian organizations like WFP or anybody who could move food at scale. We need actual in-kind food to get in there because through the emergency rooms we do in cash. We send cash in to the ERs there, but it's the like it's like also the money you send right now worth maybe half or maybe quarter its value in food. So no matter how much you send, it's still because the percentages people the to cash the money, to cash it from the online, to get it cash, you usually use almost half. then when you're buying stuff, like prices are already skyrocketed, and we all know that. And there's actually limitation on what you can buy with the money when you get it. So we actually need in-kind, we need food, similar to the intervention in Khartoum by WFP. We need something like that to kind of get in there, so at least people would have food, some food until this crisis is over.
But correct me if I'm wrong. Currently there's no electricity and there's no internet service in Al-Fasher.
There are some people using solar to kind of charge phones and stuff like that. There's access.
1%?
Yeah, it's not huge. That's how we communicate with our people in Fasher. There are Starlink that they use as well. And that's how they manage to receive the funds. But if the internet cut and there's no access to it, then they're totally trapped and they're totally on their own. There's nothing anybody could really
Because even the money transfers are done like
Okay.
and transfers. So
Right.
it needs electricity, it needs internet as well.
Right. Yeah.
I think this is from my side, we're good. We can move to questions later on. Thank you so much, Asenosi, for this presentation. Dr. Henry, I think this is your turn. Initially, we have Dr. Yona, but I don't think he joined yet. So maybe we can move on. And if he managed to join, we can let him speak later on. So Dr. Henry, please. Oh, no, I must introduce you first. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, Miss Ali, we actually had a bit of a correlation that I go first and then Etienne, because setting the scene might be helping both Etienne and Johan, since I'll be explaining the classification of the situation.
Okay, no problem. Allow me to introduce you, Prof, and then you can go ahead afterwards. So we have Prof. Martha Bradley. He's an associate professor in the Department of Public Law within the Faculty of Law, University of Johannesburg. She specializes. Professor Bradley is a Y1 National Research Foundation rated scholar. She regularly teaches internationally on topics related to international humanitarian law and conflict classification. Her teaching engagement include institutions in the Czech Republic, Islamabad, and Italy. Additionally, Professor Bradley has authored numerous publications on public international law and international humanitarian law. Prof? Oh. Prof, you're speaking first, right?
Yes. Perfect.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. The Rapid Support Forces, which since April 2023 has been fighting the Sudanese armed forces, as of 15 May 2024, identified Al-Fasher as a key battleground. The strategic aim in maintaining a siege is to force surrender and, at times, to capture the besieged area. The RSF acquired military control of the territory surrounding Al-Fasher, including all supply routes, strategically to launch a sustained and concerted military operation against the capital of North Darfur, where there is the camp of the SAF's, the Sudanese Armed Forces, 6th Infantry Division. The impact of the siege has triggered a famine in North Darfur. Famine is defined as extreme food deprivation and represents the most severe form of food insecurity. Al-Fasher is besieged approximately for 15 months, which has resulted in widespread hunger and malnutrition. Residents are eating animal feed to survive. Good afternoon. I thank the organizers for including me in this seminal event that focuses on an often overlooked humanitarian crisis, and it is so shocking to me that we do not really see much about this conflict and the dire situation on the news cycle. The purpose of my presentation is to define the nature of the situation in Sudan as an armed conflict and to account for the different parties involved in parallel non-international armed conflicts and the impact of the typology on conflict. My subject matter is the law of conflict classification and consequently the rules of international law which apply to a specific situation. That situation is the famine in Fasher, articulated in my opening remarks, and particularly through the moving testimony shared by Al-Sanosi. Thank you for the sacrifice of yourself and so many humanitarian aid workers that's trying to bring relief. The purpose of conflict classification is to determine which body of international law regulates a situation. During peacetime, situations that do not meet the requirements for armed conflict, then international human rights law apply as well as domestic law. But a situation that has escalated into an armed conflict triggers the law of international armed conflict, or IHL, in combination, of course, with human rights law. Different types of armed conflicts entail the application of different rules of international humanitarian law. And this makes it a little bit more complicated, as Etienne will demonstrate in his presentation, as the substantive law applicable to the famine and starvation in Fasher might differ depending on the parties contributing to such famine owing to the nature of the conflict. So I do apologize to the non-lawyers in the room that you will have a brief introduction to conflict classification. So there are two overall categories of conflict. The first is international armed conflict, and the second is non-international. International armed conflicts include events in which states, two or more states, engage each other militarily, or in the event of occupation, then the entire corpus of international humanitarian law applies. This body of law is much more developed than the law of non-international armed conflict, which is the second category and what we are dealing with in Sudan. So non-international armed conflicts are determined by the parties fighting each other, as well as the ferocity or intensity of fighting generated between these enemies. Non-international armed conflict is a situation in which a non-state actor or a rebel group or a dissident armed force fights either against each other or fight against another state. And the violence generated are so intense that it pushes the situation into the realm of armed conflict. There are, at the moment, multiple non-international armed conflicts ongoing at the same time in the territory of Sudan. These non-international armed conflicts are not all regulated by the same rules of IHL. This differentiation is because there are two subcategories of non-international armed conflicts, or civil wars, as they were previously referred to. The first is what we call a low-intensity non-international armed conflict, and those are the situations that meets the Tadic definition. Essentially, it means that an organized armed group has a minimal level of organization and fighting are sufficiently intense to equate to a term that we call protracted armed violence. That is basically the minimum threshold where you distinguish between sporadic acts or banditry and so forth, but crossing over into armed conflict. Then we have the second type of situation, And this we see in at least 2 instances in Sudan. Those are high-intensity non-international armed conflicts, which essentially one organized armed group, which is fighting the government, who is a party to Additional Protocol 2, and on whose territory such armed group is fighting the government, has a very sophisticated organizational structure, and they manage to control territory. Sudan is a party to Additional Protocol 2, to the 4 Geneva Conventions. And a large part of the territory in Sudan is under the control of 2 groups that it is imposing. It is important to recognize the significance of certain conflicts in Sudan qualifying as meeting the requirements of Additional Protocol 2. Why? Because Additional Protocol 2 specifically regulates the delivery of humanitarian aid, whilst Common Article 3 is silent, and Additional Protocol 2 does impose additional obligations on parties to the conflict because of territorial control. Having set the scene and introducing the consequences of conflict classifications, which is the legal framework which applies, and also the categories of war crime adjudication, because international criminal courts will first determine, was there an armed conflict or not, and then what is the type of armed conflict, because there are different war crimes according to the different typology of armed conflicts, because a rule differs. So this is quite important, especially in terms of the response to starvation in Sudan, and specifically North Darfur. So I'm very happy that Etienne will complement by explaining those rules. So specifically today, I want to explore the notion of a siege and how it contributes to the devastating experiences that those living in Fasher is suffering, and also those in close by internal displacement camps of Zamzam. Once you understand the notion of siege, you will understand the question also that Razan asked Al-Sunosi in as to why do people not leave? Well, how will they leave? They are completely encircled by RSF forces. So there are 2 parallel Additional Protocol type non-international conflicts being fought by the Sudanese armed forces against the the RSF, and second against the SLMN Al-Hilo faction. So you have 2 parallel AP2 conflicts that is ongoing, and then these 2 rebel groups also engage each other, or up until February when they struck an alliance, which we will see how that develops. The classification of 2 AP2 NIACs means that both situations satisfied the requirements of Article 1.1 of this treaty. These criteria demand a sophisticated command structure in the rebel forces, the exercise of stable military control over territory belonging to Sudan, the ability of the armed group, not the actual implementation, but the ability of the armed group to implement Additional Protocol 2 in the territory under its control, and to use that territory to launch planned and frequent military operations. That is a high-intensity non-international armed conflict. So first, the non-international armed conflict between Sudan and the Rapid Support Forces ignited on 15 April 2023, when the Rapid Support Forces broke with the Sudanese armed forces and fighting erupted in Khartoum, the capital of Sudan. As the RSF are military trained, formerly were incorporated into the Sudanese armed forces and have access to similar weaponry equipment as the Sudanese armed forces, the intensity of violence generated from the beginning of the conflict was very much akin to that of international armed conflict. So this is a very high intensity conflict from the very beginning. At the start of the conflict, fighting was concentrated in Khartoum, and the parties tried to dominate parts of Khartoum, but fortunately, the SAF managed in May 2025 to liberate Khartoum from the RSF, but that led to the RSF even more so intensifying its efforts in North Darfur. And this is where I direct your attention to the strategy employed by the RSF in North Darfur, because a lot of the humanitarian crises that we are seeing are a consequence of the way that they are fighting SAF in Al Fasher. So, the RSF managed to, over time, take control over all of the surrounding territory in North Darfur that surrounds Al Fasher, meaning you can't go in or out without RSF permission. The territorial control enables RSF to repeatedly attack Al Fasher, where, indeed, the state armed forces of Sudan remains trapped. It is the last city in Sudan where there is, in North Darfur, in the North Darfur region where the Sudanese armed forces still have a stronghold. And this siege of Al Fasher began on 15 May 2024 after the RSF has strategically obtained control all around Al Fasher. So strategic battles were fought in preparation of the siege, and by the end of December 2023, the RSF captured Gezira State, Wad Medani, east of Khartoum. By March 2024, the RSF controlled the northern, eastern, and southeastern districts of Al Fasher, as well as vast areas outside the city, including very critical transit routes for humanitarian aid. And these are transit routes from Libya, Chad, and Khartoum. The SAF launched airstrikes against RSF strongholds in Al Fasher and adjacent areas, but the RSF also has access to drones and very sophisticated weaponry. We are all aware of certain allegations about the involvement of the UAE and so forth. So from 21 January 2025, the RSF continuously launched drone strikes and encircled Al Fasher from the east and the west. During February 2025, the RSF even attacked a Zamzam refugee camp, which is in the proximity of Al Fasher, because it's part of the territory in its strategy to encircle Al Fasher. On or around 14 and 15 June, the RSF launched a targeted operation, a ground operation, against the SAF in Al Fasher, again using heavy artillery, aerial drone strikes, and so forth. This caused a very high death toll and resulted in many wounded fighters and soldiers. The attack was so intense that the UN Human Rights High Commissioner called for de-escalation. Because of siege, humanitarian aid cannot reach Al Fasher. And this is quite an interesting conundrum. Usually, when academics think about AP2 type conflicts and getting humanitarian aid to those in need, you struggle to get government permission because that's a requirement under Article 18.2. But in this case of the siege, even if you have government permission, the law is not helpful, because how do you get humanitarian aid in the event of a siege? And furthermore, part of the strategy, and Etienne will elaborate, is that electric facilities, hydroelectrical dams used for electricity generating, and water facilities have also been specifically targeted, which escalates the situation and further fuels frequent waves of cholera outbreaks. Whilst cholera is actually quite treatable, the nature of the siege is escalating this even further. And this, unfortunately, and I'm so grateful that we're bringing attention to Al Fasher, But this is not the only siege or area under siege that is ongoing in Sudan. Even in areas close to the Nuba Mountains, there's also areas of sieges where the SPLM North is involved, because it seems like the strategy of besieging has been adopted by enemies. But it really is critical that the international community, and that specifically this conflict gets more attention. It is shocking to me, again, if I may reiterate that we do not see much about the situation on the news, which is one of the most dire at present, and perhaps the biggest famine that is ongoing. So thank you so much to the Center of Human Rights for bringing much needed attention. I'm looking forward to hear more from Etienne and Jonah.
Prof, thank you so much for your presentation. You gave a very thorough legal analysis of what's happening in Al-Fasher. And also it's very important because classifying the war accurately also reflects on what rules of protection the citizens might have at their disposal for later, maybe even accountability steps later on. Dr. Henry, allow me to introduce you and then we move on to your part. Dr. Etienne Henry is an independent legal consultant and a lecturer in international humanitarian law at University of Neuchâtel. So I practiced yesterday to see if I'm going to say it right.
He has a beautiful French accent, so he can pronounce for us.
No, I'm doing my best, so excusez-moi if I'm butchering these pronunciations. Okay, his recent work includes contributing to the Geneva Academy's research project on IHL in Focus. So the report mainly focuses on Gaza, which is very important, and it's going also to be discussed today in our webinar. Prof, you might go ahead. Thank you so much. Please, over to you.
Yes, thank you for the kind introduction. And thank you also for having me today. It's a very interesting topic. So I was asked to speak about starvation as a weapon and make a comparative analysis of Al-Fasher and Gaza. I thought that it would be best to focus my presentation on the law as it applies to both situations, rather than on a detailed discussion of the facts. I will start by stressing an important distinction in this regard concerning the applicable law. As Marty explained very well, the armed conflict in Sudan, especially the conflict opposing the RSF and the SAF, qualifies as an armed conflict not of an international character, to use the terms of Common Article 3 of the 1949 Geneva Conventions. The second additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions is also applicable. The classification of the armed conflict in Gaza is more controversial and remains debated among scholars and practitioners. For reasons that I cannot explain here due to time constraints, I would argue, however, that it is an international armed conflict. At least this is the most plausible approach when it comes to rules that confer protection on the civilian population, such as the rule on the prohibition of starvation. This means that different rules apply to both situations, and this may lead to substantial differences between the applicable regimes. I will mention some of these discrepancies in the course of my presentation. So the prohibition of the starvation of the civilian population, so this is a method of warfare that is prohibited in all armed conflicts, whether non-international or international. The prohibition is prescribed by the two additional protocols of 1977 to the Geneva Conventions of 1949. Nowadays, it is also generally recognized as a rule of customary international law that is also binding on states that are not parties to the additional protocols, such as, for instance, Israel. It is also accepted that the prohibition applies equally in international armed conflict and non-international armed conflict. Starvation is understood as the intentional deprivation of essential foodstuffs and/or water. A violation of the prohibition may take place even in the absence of evidence that civilians have died because of the conduct of a party. However, the deliberate starvation of enemy forces as opposed to civilians is not prohibited under international humanitarian law. It is even sometimes mentioned as a legitimate method of warfare. This is, for instance, the case of some military manuals. The general prohibition of starvation of civilians is complemented by a special protection afforded to objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, such as foodstuffs, agricultural areas for the production of foodstuffs, crops, livestock, drinking water installations, and supplies and irrigation works. The list is not exhaustive. It is thus generally prohibited to attack, destroy, remove, or render useless such objects. From a protection point of view, the main limitation of the prohibition is that, as already mentioned, it only prohibits acts committed with the purpose of causing starvation. In other words, intentional acts of starvation. It might be difficult in some cases to prove the intentional character of starvation. As a result, the prohibition of starvation of civilians does not effectively protect civilians against food or water deprivation that occurs as a collateral effect of the conduct of hostilities. But other rules of international humanitarian law are relevant in this respect. In the remaining time, I will attempt to address these other rules and their relationship with the prohibition of starvation. I will begin by outlining the three main factors that, in my view, may lead to starvation. I will then structure the rest of my presentation around these three factors and the relevant rules of international humanitarian law. As said, I consider that three main factors may lead to the starvation of civilians. Both in Gaza and El Fasher, it is, of course, a combination of these factors that has led to the current famine. It is, however, useful to address these factors separately because each of them raises a distinct set of legal issues. I will first briefly describe them from a purely factual standpoint, and then I will address the specific legal issues that each of them raise. First, the poisoning or contamination of water may result in dehydration and the spread of waterborne diseases, as is the case, for instance, with cholera outbreaks that have already been mentioned. Waterborne diseases, in turn, may aggravate malnutrition and cause further dehydration. This is a well-known vicious circle. Second, starvation may be the outcome of measures aimed at disrupting access to foodstuffs and water, either by preventing the free movement of civilians or by denying them access to humanitarian relief. This is highly relevant in the context of siege warfare or in cases where the free passage of humanitarian relief is not allowed by the parties to the conflict. Third, starvation may result from acts aimed at objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. The problem with this is that not all acts of destruction are necessarily always covered by the prohibition that I mentioned earlier. I will now briefly address the distinct legal issues raised by these three causal factors. First, regarding the poisoning of water, it is worth recalling that the prohibition of the deliberate poisoning of water wells counts among the most ancient known rules of restraint in warfare in the history of mankind. It was, for instance, mentioned in the laws of Manu in ancient India. This is not purely anecdotal. Instances of poisoning of water wells were documented during the earlier conflict in Darfur in the 2000s. Now, the contamination of water may also result from deliberate attacks against objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian populations, such as water treatment plants. Such attacks would, in most cases, qualify as manifest violations of international humanitarian law. One problem, however, is that in some cases, the disruption of water purification services or wastewater discharge may result from attacks against so-called dual-use objects, such as power stations. Power stations may, under some circumstances, qualify as legitimate military objectives. The legality of an attack will then revolve around issues of compliance with the duty to minimize civilian harm and to take precautionary measures, or the principle of proportionality in attack. In such cases, it becomes more difficult to assess the legality of attacks because a full assessment requires having access to the information that was available to the military commander at the time of the attack. And here there is also a distinction to be drawn between the law applicable in Gaza and the law applicable in Darfur. Under the Rome Statute of the ICC, it is a war crime in international armed conflicts to intentionally launch clearly disproportionate attacks. There is, however, no equivalent provision applicable in non-international armed conflicts. I will now turn to the second factor that I identified, namely starvation that may result from the deliberate deprivation of access to foodstuffs or water. This may, of course, happen in situations of siege warfare if the population is not allowed to leave the besieged locality to fetch food and water. This is why the prohibition of starvation is closely related with the rules on the prohibition of forced displacement and the duty of the parties to the conflict to allow for the evacuation of localities that are put in danger by the conduct of hostilities. It is perhaps useful to recall in this regard that the prohibition of the starvation of civilians is a relatively recent development in the history of the law of armed conflict. Until well into the 20th century, it was considered, in the context of siege warfare, that the indiscriminate deprivation of essential foodstuffs and water of all inhabitants of a locality, combatants and civilians alike, was a legitimate method of warfare. An example that comes in mind is the siege of Leningrad during the Second World War. It was even admitted that the besieging party could shoot at civilians attempting to flee the locality to force them to return. The rationale was that the more people remained in the locality, the faster food supplies would be depleted, leading to the earlier surrender of the besieged forces. This is obviously no longer the case today. There is clearly a duty for the parties to the conflict to allow the evacuation of civilian persons who wish to leave a besieged locality. If evacuations are ordered, it is also crucial that the party ordering the evacuation complies with its duty to ensure that the civilian population is received under satisfactory conditions of shelter, hygiene, health, safety, and nutrition. Starvation may also happen if humanitarian relief is not allowed in a besieged locality. This is perhaps the area where the discrepancies between the law applicable in Gaza and the law applicable in Darfur are most evident. Generally speaking, both in international and non-international armed conflict, parties to the conflict must allow the free passage of humanitarian relief, provided that several conditions are fulfilled. According to the ICRC, for instance, the parties to the conflict must allow and facilitate rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for civilians in need, which is impartial in character and conducted without any adverse distinction, subject to their right of control. This provision does not necessarily offer full protection against starvation because a party to the conflict may plausibly justify the denial of free passage of humanitarian relief if it has serious reasons to believe that the aid is not reaching the persons in need and is instead benefiting the other party, for instance, due to insufficient controls. However, in international armed conflict, the 1949 Fourth Geneva Convention provides that the occupying power, so in cases of belligerent occupation, this is the special regime applicable in occupied territory, In such cases, the occupying power is held directly responsible for ensuring the necessary supply of foodstuffs and other essential articles. In addition to this, if supply is nevertheless inadequate, an occupying power shall agree to relief schemes on behalf of the said population and shall facilitate them by all the means at its disposal. And this shall be done without delay. So this is arguably a stricter requirement. And this is one of the reasons why the controversy over the status of the Gaza Strip as occupied territory or not is so important. In a ruling of 27 March 2025, the Israeli Supreme Court, acting as High Court of Justice, held that the Gaza Strip was not under belligerent occupation, and for this reason that only the general regime applied. The better and widely accepted view, however, is that Israel is an occupying power in the Gaza Strip, at least when it comes to these issues of humanitarian relief. Now, the third factor that I mentioned is the destruction of objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population.
Doctor, sorry to interrupt, but you have 1 minute left.
Okay, I'll try to do it quickly. So the special protection under this rule is unfortunately not absolute. The prohibition is limited to attacks that are committed with the purpose of causing starvation. It is not enough, for instance, in measures aimed at the disruption of water services to say that water will be drunk equally by inhabitants and combatants or enemy forces. That would not justify cutting access to water. But in other situations, for instance, if a facility is used for military purposes, thus turning it into a military objective, that it might turn it into a legitimate military objective, and then the legality would depend on compliance with the general rules on the conduct of hostilities. And here again, there is a discrepancy between the law applicable in Gaza and Darfur, because in the Rome Statute, as adopted in 1998, there is a provision containing the war crime of intentionally using starvation. There was no such provision in the Rome Statute applicable in non-international armed conflict until 2019. But to this day, it remains to be seen whether it may apply to the situation of Darfur or not. So maybe just a few concluding remarks. It is a well-known fact, at least since the work of Amartya Sen and others, that most cases of famine are the result of policy failures rather than simply the lack of food. And I think this is especially true in situations of armed conflict. Unfortunately, international humanitarian law does not provide an absolute protection against the effect of warfare. It would be also unreasonable to expect perfect compliance with IHL from the parties to any armed conflict. However, it requires a combination of systematic and pervasive violations of IHL to lead to disasters like the current situations in El Fasher and Gaza. Both situations result from a combination of violations of international humanitarian law, the reckless conduct of hostilities, or even direct attacks against civilian objects and persons, combined with the denial of humanitarian access and unjustified restrictions to the movement of civilian persons. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Henry. Correct me if I'm wrong. So we're saying that the rules of international law that applies to Gaza and applies to Fasher are completely different. So when we talk about Gaza, we're talking about occupation, international armed conflict in that sense. And according to Prof. Martha's classification, when we talk about El Fasher, it's a non-international armed conflict. So there is general protection, but also specific protections depends on the different classification of the conflict, right? Okay, I have a couple of questions that I would like to ask the two of you, but after Dr. Yono speaks. So now allow me to introduce Dr. Yono, and then we'll move to questions and answers. So Dr. Yana Diamond is an international human rights lawyer at Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, specializing in atrocity prevention and accountability. Alongside Mr. Muhtasim Ali, he served as a lead co-author to Breaches of the Genocide Convention in Darfur, an independent inquiry. And he's also the co-founder of the Sudan Task Force for Accountability and Justice. His work advancing innovative accountability protection and humanitarian responses to atrocities in Sudan has been widely covered, including by the BBC, New York Times, The Guardian, CNN, Opinion Viewers, Justice Security, and others. Dr. Yona, you're so much welcome. I hope you're feeling better. We didn't know if you're gonna make it or not. I'm glad to see you on board. Yes. Yeah.
Thank
now
you,
you're.
Rosa. Can you hear me all right? Yeah.
Yeah, now I can hear you. I'm particularly excited for your presentation because we now have a profound academic theoretical overview of what's happening. Now, as a practitioner, please give us your opinion. And can you please go into what's happening regionally and internationally in Sudan in terms of accountability to whether to the RSF or whether to staff? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And yeah, apologies, I was a bit late. I was recovering, but yeah, I think I approach this the content of this event with, yeah, as you mentioned, a slightly different perspective from the practitioner point of view, but also someone who has written on some of these issues, but coming out of a frustration with the international humanitarian law and theory and how we can actually because I think there's a real lack of movement on addressing the urgency of the situation in North Darfur. What the RSF has done in West Darfur threatens to repeat itself now. It's not only the siege, but once the RSF invades El Fasher, potentially, let's say, the largely non-Arab groups inhabiting the area, hundreds of thousands of civilians are now at risk of similar atrocities that have occurred in West Darfur, and so there's a lot of overlapping crimes happening. So it's not, to focus just on starvation would, from an accountability perspective, kind of it's a bit divorced from the reality in terms of like how do we go after the sources of conflict in general, because it's so hard internationally to actually bring, let's say, perpetrators or enablers to court. But if there is a hook to bring under any sort of convention or violation, and pretty much all of them are happening, in Darfur, that provides a basis for us to run with. And so, I'll just mention, a year into the conflict, we released a report, and our approach is, we've been producing these inquiries into violations of the Genocide Convention, but we're also about to release one on crimes against humanity against children and war crimes against children. And the model we've been developing is, to bypass the obstacles of going to court, we'll assemble a group of experts, subject matter experts, open source intelligence, and international law experts to come to legal findings and an analysis of the situation, so that then those findings can be used to increase further attention and resources and opportunities to hold the RSF, SAF, but also their external backers accountable. So a big focus of our reports are identifying, because we know that this conflict, and no conflict really happens in a vacuum. We all really know about the UAE's involvement, but when you talk about accountability, like historically, there's been a major impunity gap in terms of going after the source of the weapons and the political cover and the financing, without which the parties simply cannot commit these atrocities. So, and without their and with with their pressure, perhaps the conflict can end tomorrow, right? So the external backers like the UAE and on the south side, they're receiving weapons from like Turkey, Egypt, Iran, Russia, um, and regional countries are also supplying weapons, but largely coming from the UAE through regional countries. And so what we've been trying to do is identify um, their complicity in these crimes, and then the obligation on all states to end their arms transfers to those states that are supplying the RSF. Um, and I mean, I guess for those in the audience who aren't fully aware, the UAE serves as a main supply line and source of the RSF's violence and its genocide on the ground. They're conducting massive campaign of near daily, or this has been documented, pretty frequent cargo flights of advanced heavy weaponry coming through neighboring countries, and these shipments coincide with escalations on the ground. Anyways, there's there, if you follow the money and the weapons and the arms, you'll see where it lands. And so we're trying to get realistic with potentially how to stop the enablers. And we founded this task force for accountability and justice we are where we're surveying different litigation options, primarily at the International Court of Justice for the UAE and other countries' complicity and violations of the conventions, but also potentially against Sudan for its violations. And then we're also tracking corporate entities that are involved in maybe producing weapons or supplying weapons, or the private jet. I mean the aircraft needed to transport gold and other and weapons in and out of the country. So yeah, I hope this is somewhat helpful in terms of our approach, and just to bring it back to mass starvation. This report that we're going to be releasing this month on crimes against children, you know, it's largely an impetus for this report has been the catastrophe unfolding in Al Fasher, where children are the first to suffer the consequences and are the most vulnerable to the diseases that were described earlier, and starvation. Um, and and so we're trying to shine a spotlight, but also center those victims who have maybe historically been overlooked in accountability discussions. And we hope that this upcoming report will have a similar impact to the one determining that there was the genocide in West Darfur, and by identifying also the external backers responsible for complicity in the crimes against humanity and war crimes against children. So on the question of whether it's the question of non-international armed conflict, um, this particular report is looking at the frameworks of crimes against humanity and also war crimes, but all of these apply in this context, and what we're trying to do is pressure states to prevent these violations of the Geneva Conventions or the Genocide Convention or elimination of racial discrimination. And one last thing is really important to note is that the UN Security Council has only issued two major resolutions on the conflict, very despicably, right? Absolute abomination, shameful, maybe the most shameful response to the most serious crimes. But the one resolution that one of the two resolutions. The first was calling for a ceasefire during Ramadan. The second was this is 2736, calling for the RSF to end the siege. This was already in June 2024. So you know that the siege was already begun, as we've mentioned, 15, 16 months ago. But these are also legal grounds to bring to courts and to states to ensure that they comply with the obligation to end the siege. And the other is, of course, the arms embargo on Darfur, which also comes from the UN Security Council, the long-standing arms embargo, which serves as a basis to hold the external states supplying weapons to account. So thank you so much. I hope this was a helpful background on our work, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yana. I really appreciate your presentation. It begs many questions in my mind. So, Prof. Marta, when we start the questions and answers session, which is supposed to start now, this is the first questions that I'm going to ask, is that considering the heavy involvement of UAE, and I think it's fair now to say that it's not just allegations, because the evidence is just so overwhelming to the point that I think it can give us at least a sense of confirmation that this is actually happening. So with the level of the involvement in what's happening in Sudan, would this encourage a reclassification of the war? Are we meeting the criteria of maybe internationalized armed conflict at this point or not?
I can respond to that if you wish. In terms of conflict classification, and I think you're probably thinking about the situation in the DRC with M23 and Rwanda and that relationship, it is not enough. If those in the room that did international law undergrad might recall the Nicaragua case, but to classify or reclassify a situation as being internationalized, you have to show that the armed group is actually a proxy of a state. And it's a very high criteria to qualify a rebel group as a proxy. It's more than, and I know this sounds counterintuitive because so much is sometimes done by states, but it's not enough to make them a party to the conflict and bound by IHL. So even if the UAE, or there's a lot of public available information that does suggest that, is supplying weapons, or even, I don't know if they do any training, I'm not privy to that information, but supplying weapons, giving funding, and so forth is not sufficient to bind the UAE by international humanitarian law. There might be other laws that apply, but it won't be that their state responsibility are triggered yet, but we don't know. Publicly available information is what academics are privy to. So it will have to be shown that the UAE actually makes calls on the ground in fighting strategy, and so forth to qualify overall control, so that the situation is indeed an international armed conflict. And I have not yet been able to find such information, but it is possible that perhaps other crimes could be used to hold the UAE responsible, which are not war crimes, because there's overlap, and Etienne and Jonah will know much more about this than me, but there are overlap in terms of crimes against humanity, which is a crime of scale and can coexist with an armed conflict, but there doesn't need to be a link with the armed conflict. So this is all legal technicalities, but at the moment, I would say, based on the publicly available information, the UAE is not a party to the conflict, and the RSF remains a party to a non-international armed conflict until we see the nature of control on the day-to-day military operations on the ground. Till then, IHL is not binding the UAE. Perhaps weapons law or those kind of things, but not at the moment. LONIAC or IAC law does not apply to the UAE in this situation.
I see. Thank you. Dr. Yana, allow me to ask you this. I don't know if you would be the most competent person to answer my question or not, but with the politics of human rights itself, what are the prospects of holding external factors accountable? Because I have read your report and I have seen how you mentioned the numbers of other factors that are involved in the Sudanese war, but then yet again, we have seen what happened in the ICJ. And I also think the fact that the Sudanese government is deeply, deeply involved in these violations also makes the image a bit tainted. Like you can't come seek justice with blood in your hand. So considering UAE's, but for me as a Sudanese national, I would always say that, okay, the UAE might not be the reason that the war started in the first place, but they are definitely the reason why the war is continued until this very day. So considering the UAE is backed by the US, they're basically the allies of the US in the Middle East and Israel as well. What are the prospects of actual accountability?
Yeah, no, that's a difficult question. You want me to answer? But in terms of Sudan bringing this case, I actually do think that this is something that we're kind of strategizing around, and that there are issues with the case that was brought earlier this year against the UAE. Like it was really kind of doomed from the beginning, and it was really a political showmanship kind of thing because they were trying to score points. It wasn't really trying to be successful at the court, because otherwise they would have pled more significant factual and like legal record. But I think just from optics perspective, like Sudan to take a case against the UAE, the way that the media covers it and the way the world understands it is not necessarily the SAF bringing this case. It's really like Sudan telling the UAE to get out of our country kind of thing, which could be pretty powerful. Anyways, that's just something that I was thinking about lately. But in terms of the UAE's influence and I think Professor Martha put it really. I mean, I just to respond to that though, like I think I think in general, and I'm a major skeptic of international humanitarian law and like even international criminal law because of a lot of the failures of the past. I think it's time to, like, seeing the amount of impunity going on right now, like it's also important to reassess like the value of these systems when telling parties to the conflict to comply with their obligations is maybe not the best, like how, so like how do we more concretely like prevent arms from getting to the hands or pressuring their backers. But yeah, I think but I think you're right, like the UAE wields a lot. We've found that the UAE is definitely very influential, but I don't think that should stop the international community from seeking accountability. Yeah.
Thank you so much. One point that I forgot about your presentation, I like the fact that you emphasize that the minute that the siege is broken in Al Fasher, we are looking at another Junaina incidents, which is, I think this is the point where people miss. And I think it adds on the frustration that the international community is actually not doing anything. So yeah, and I think now we can move to questions. There are two questions in the. Anyone have a question?
Sorry, Rizan, if I could just add in, because I think that Jonah added something very important, and that is the other types of war crimes that's also being committed, like sexual and gender-based violence and so forth. It is indeed not only starvation, and I think that is also an element, if you look at how the RSF is attacking, that they are attacking civilians. A lot of times their attacks are launched not against their enemy, but against innocent civilians. So indeed, the question that I also haven't thought of, and I think that's such a valuable point, is what happens if the siege is successful? It seems like that will just be a complete butchering. And what does the consequences, I guess, in a sense, is a failure of what are the real consequences of the commission of Euskogens or erga omnes or all these legal words if we see this kind of suffering. But I must compliment, of course, Dr. Diamond for the important work that they're doing to bring attention, because it is shocking that nothing is really being done by the international community.
Yes, I remember in my first classes, second year of law, our international human rights professor always used to say that the problem with the international human rights framework is not preventive, it's just reactive to whatever is happening. So unfortunately, this is exactly what's happening now in Gaza, with Congo, and Sudan as well. So we have 2 questions. For our audience, anyone has a question can raise their hand or feel free to type it down. But okay, I'm going to say the questions, and then whoever wants to answer can answer. What are some of the interests of third parties that would provide funding to keep the violations ongoing? Second question, is there any obligation on the SAF, Sudanese Armed Forces, to surrender al-Fasher in order to end the siege? If the SAF came to an agreement with RSF to leave with the people of al-Fasher and save them rather than holding on to the territory whilst using the civilians to hold into a territory. Third question, Mr. Diamond, you spoke about past violations and abuse on vulnerable and marginalized populations who have been overlooked. What is the implications of these past violations and how have them intensified the actual violations? Okay, I think, Yona, you can start.
The question about the one directed for me, the past violations. I'm not sure I fully. I mean, I guess I was trying to underline the patterns of the RSF attacks against the vulnerable populations in Darfur and what we already know, and so you know, we have the predictive powers to see what lies ahead in terms of their modus operandi and how they've been screening people trying to flee al-Fasher for their identities, and that's sort of what I was getting at.
Okay, also, I think the first question you might also try to attempt to answer it. What are some of the interests of third parties that would provide funding to keep all the violations ongoing?
You want me to answer that, or?
Yes.
Oh, I think, I mean, like, you mean like, so like UAE is like really, you know, is trying to diversify its economy through, you know, financing a genocidal militia and financing conflicts, not only in Sudan, but also Libya, Ethiopia, and Yemen. And but Darfur, you know, I mean, but Sudan has a lot of valuable mineral resources and like largely gold. You know, most of the gold is ends up in the UAE, and also access to agricultural and the seaport and yeah, other precious resources. So it's just, you know, they're basically committing violence to advance their business interests. Yeah.
Yes. I think Dr. Henry or Prof could attempt to answer this question. Is there any obligation on the SAF to surrender al-Fasher in order to end the siege? And if the SAF came to an agreement with the RSF to leave with the people of al-Fasher and save them rather than holding the territory whilst using the civilians to hold into the territory?
Oh, I think the answer is clearly negative. So from the point of view of international law, the SAF and so they are on the side of the government of Sudan. So Sudan has the prerogative to restore law and order on its territory. And I think you could not make this argument. If I may add maybe just a quick comment on the issue that was raised earlier about the involvement of third actors. I think it's important to stress, I totally agree with what Marta explained, but I think it's also important to stress that all states parties to the Geneva Conventions have a duty to ensure respect for the convention in all circumstances, so which means beyond situations of armed conflict. Even if they are not party to an armed conflict, they are bound to ensure respect. So delivering weapons to a state that is knowing, or to a party that is knowingly committing abuses, I think would be a violation of this duty. There is a very interesting ongoing case now at the International Court of Justice filed by Nicaragua against Germany related to the delivery of weapons to Israel. So it will be very interesting to see how the court will deal with that in the future.
Just to add on, Etienne makes a very important point, and this is about the external obligation of Common Article 1. And apart from the United Kingdom, the US, and Canada, I'm not aware that when the customary corollary of external obligation was formed, that the UAE actually persistently objected. So indeed, this means that the UAE will be bound to uphold and ensure the enforcement of IHL. So that is a very, very interesting point. Unfortunately, we have seen very little of the magic that, or if Common Article 1 actually delivers on the promise that it makes in the Geneva Convention. So we hope to see, I'm looking forward to see what the ICJ does specifically with that decision. But indeed, I was reading also, Sassoli, one of the biggest authors in IHL, and I was reading in his latest book in terms of siege, and could I find something there in terms of outlawing the way of fighting a siege. And unfortunately, for Antoni's question, you can't do that. And also the message that it will send would be rebel groups take over territory, do a siege, and then the government will surrender. And that might inspire others to do the same, almost to achieve a coup d'etat or an overthrow of a government, because indeed this is the last piece of North Darfur that has not been consolidated. So the consequence of RSF rule, whilst noting what happens to civilians under RSF rules, are also very, very, very alarming, although publicly available information does suggest that no one has clean hands in this conflict. All parties have violated IHL on a very, very large scale. So unfortunately, the law is not giving us the answers in terms of this one.
Yes, but this is very important, Prof, because you actually mentioned this. You actually cautioned from doing anything that would set precedents for others, because you already now mentioned that there is another siege happening in other parts of Darfur or in the west of Sudan in general, and it's only used now. The Hilo is only using it because he has seen how successful it is in El Fasher. So yes, I understand. We got another question. It says, interested in hearing the view of the panelists on the role of the African regional, including AU, and the regional economic communities in minimizing the harm of civilians caused in El Fasher, and also in ending the violence generally.
I don't know if any of my colleagues have had a more effective experience from the Peace and Security Council of the African Union, but despite some mentions in Peace and Security Council, AU Peace and Security Council resolutions, mostly critiquing the RSF, not really mentioning the SAF. It's the language of condoning. It's more frequent than in the UN, which was also shocking to me when I was researching, and also only finding 2 resolutions mentioning probably the words famine of our time. That was quite surprising, but indeed the Peace and Security Council of the AU mentions it, they condemn it, but we don't see any action, or I could not pick up any material action or engagement or facilitation. Perhaps my fellow panelists has more information on this, but it seems like it's just political lip service.
If I may add to this,
Let me jump in on that. I mean, you know, one of the reasons I think, like kind of, I don't know, coming to this is totally like look at it as like very academic kind of webinar, and I'm kind of like from an advocacy background. But we've been advocating about the situation in El Fasher, in El Ubaid, and in Kadugli for 2 years, right? We haven't seen any action or any resolution. How much information is enough for the world to make a move, right? I mean, I was deliberate in, making my presentation really short. Everybody knows about what is happening in El Fasher. This is not news to anybody. It's been in policy briefs. It's been in, situational updates. It's been on the news. It's been on the New York Times. It's been everywhere. And we've been advocating in each and every platform we could find about the severity of the situation on the ground. Shy attempts have been made here and there by the UN, by the AU, and while people are still dying every day as we speak. If the law is too hard to be applied in this situation and force an end to this situation, how about we try alternatives? How about shaming the backers out of this situation? It worked in Yemen. It could work again in Al-Fasher. Where is the political will to end the suffering of people of Sudan? These are the questions that I'm really interested about. It's like, collectively with all the organizations, there was a question earlier on the Q&A, and I answered it by text, but who has the funding and who's working on Fasher? There is so many organizations right now. If you can reach out to all of them, and I can give you the names. There's Al-Malam, there's Gold, there's CARE, there's MSF, there's Triangle, there's Solidarity, there is Save a World, there is through the IRC, the Save the Children. All of them are there, but the situation is still dire in Al-Fasher, right? So what are we doing collectively to end this suffering? The tools have been used for 2 years to do anything and been not proven not successful. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think there's a lack of political will to end the suffering. And yes, as Leona said, yes, there are people who are benefiting from prolonging this this suffering, but what is the cost? What is the cost? 1.5 million people. We're talking now about 100,000 remaining, and if the siege is successful, Prof. Martha said earlier, if the siege is successful, the people will die from hunger. If they pin it down and they enter, and it will be another situation and another genocide. The same situation applies to Kadugli. It's already a famine declared in southern Kordofan.
I just want to add on this, Asanosi. Yesterday, I was looking into statistics on the ethnicity of people now remaining in Al-Fasher. So I lived in Al-Fasher. I lived in Al-Fasher for a year plus. So I know there's only one Arab neighborhood in Al-Fasher. So I'm not sure if the people, I couldn't find anything about that, but I'm not sure if this neighborhood the people still live there or not. But let's just be more decisive and say things as it is at this point. If they manage to continue this, if RSF managed to get into Al-Fasher and the people remaining there everyone will die. Let's just put it like this. Not just die, butchered, especially if they come from Afro-ethnic groups. The only people that they would have a chance of surviving are this Arab neighborhood. And I'm not so sure if they're still there or not. I couldn't find information, to be honest.
I'm sorry, Razan, this is not a war. This is not Arab versus non-Arab thing. I mean, the forces actually now, from the RSF sieging Al-Fasher are from all kinds of tribes of Darfur, right? The majority of people in Al-Fasher, we know that from one ethnic group. Most of whom left, and there's those who will not leave and they will remain there. Let's just talk on the human level of things. It's not about which tribe and not getting annihilated or not. It's about, like, just even forget about Fasher. Like if this is happening in Kadugli, it's there's children, there's women, there's old people, no matter where the race is, whether they're Arab or non-Arab. This is a situation that demands an actual action. Talking and condemning it and saying this and saying that doesn't do it. These people are being hit from the ground, from above. No matter who's, it's about ending the war to me. It's literally about ending the war. And we need to do something to end the war. We need to collectively do something to end the war.
Could I ask?
Thank you, Sunosi. I see we have another. Please go, Dr. I also know that you asked to be excused early.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask Al-Sanusi one thing, if that's all right. I was wondering, you mentioned that the humanitarian organizations like MSF, Save the World, Save the Children, Malam. Do you think that these organizations are like could we be receiving more information on the extent of the famine or on the other side, like who's responsible for like where the like what the RSF exactly is doing? Like I'm just trying to think about in terms of like also like coverage. Like, do you think there's a lack of because journalists can't really access the area, right? So is that a major issue, or do you think there's like sufficient people documenting the the atrocities and the experience of the victims? Like,
Yeah, I mean, there is a lack of, there is a lack of access to the area, like to journalists, to humanitarians. Some humanitarians are there as well. Some humanitarians are only operating in certain areas because they can't get access to other areas, stuff like that. And then back to the question of working in places who are controlled by SAF, working in places that are controlled by the RSF. And these are actually also some of the major issues that people are facing now in Sudan. It's like there's some organizations that they can't cross line because of the, safety issues, because of, just trying to not upset one of the, one of the warring parties. And I think that shouldn't be a factor when you're trying to help people. You should be able to help people cross line without consequences. We have seen recently hits on Relief International staff by the RSF. People got killed. We have also seen an aerial bombardment on a WFP shipment heading to the camp. What happened? What did the world do? They condemned hardly on social media, on Twitter, and on but there's no consequences. When we talk about accountability, how can we bring accountability among this, like, ever shifting environment, like within the shifting environment? It's not just about accountability to the backers. that's something, how can we get accountability to the people who are holding the guns? And like right now, the RSF would allow you to enter as a journalist, to enter like Niala maybe or something, but they won't allow you to enter Fasher. Similar situation was happening before also on the other side. It's like, so we need to really kind of zoom out of what is happening and look at the broader picture. This is a war against the people. This is not just SAF versus the RSF. This is war against the people of Sudan. Look at it across everywhere. The fatalities, the most people getting affected are the civilians, those who are not holding a gun. That is pushing more people to actually bear arms and hold guns. So yeah.
So now,
Just to add in, sorry if I may, the
Okay.
MSF, Doctors Without Borders,
Yep.
recently also
Prof,
withdrew.
just
Yeah.
1 minute. I will just 1 minute. There is a questions from Ela. She was raising the hand. So Ela, if you may, you can state your question. Then we continue with our discussion. I don't see them around anymore. Yeah, I think they left the discussion. Okay, Prof, before I get to you, there is a comment that I want to state from Mary Rebecca Jolica. I agree with you, Mr. Adam, on the fact that for international community, no more information is needed for them to act. However, for the general public, it is very important. I think it is very revealing how conflicts in Africa are underreported in the world media. We can see that it is the case also for DRC conflict. We have seen how reporting frequently on conflicts can generate reactions and actions from the civil society. For instance, about the Israel-Gaza conflict, people who have not at top political officials are taking initiatives at their levels. So I think that is why bringing into the light sufferings of people from conflict is crucial, because more people will be talking about it, and there will be more mobilization worldwide trying to help. Maybe some of these conflicts are not as complex as Israel-Gaza war, and these public mobilization and CSO's pressure could have helped pressure the national and international community to actually end the conflict. Thank you, Rebecca, for your comment. I needed to say one thing about the questions about the AU mechanisms. I think also when it comes to the AU, the situation is a bit complicated, considering the fact that Sudan's memberships at the AU has been suspended in 2021 after the coup. And then with other economic blocks, so Sudan is only member to IGAD. We actually submitted an application to be part of the EIC, but it was rejected. But with the IGAD, there was, I think, the first conference at the world, the IGAD invited Himeti to the meeting. Then as a response, the SAF suspended their membership at the IGAD. So I think at the regional level, also Sudan is not doing very well, and it's a bit complicated. Prof, over to you. And I think after that, we can conclude our webinar.
I just actually wanted to add something based on what Al-Sanusi mentioned. And I saw that recently in Al-Fasher, it's been so unsafe that Doctors Without Borders actually had to withdraw. So even if they're funding, one of the issues in the area is the safety of humanitarian aid workers who's constantly under attack. So that also further adds to the situation. I saw some other remarks. I agree with it. I think everyone on this call, or all of the panelists, focus on bringing attention to underreported conflicts in Africa. That is something that is very, I think, a common pursuit in terms of all of us. But it is really shocking when you do research like what Etienne and I am doing, or what Jonah is doing, and you really struggle to find sources or information on the conflict in Niger, the conflict in Burkina Faso, the conflict in CAR, the conflict in South Sudan, the conflict in Sudan. It's so underreported. Whilst if you look for violations in Ukraine or in Gaza, then there is almost so much information you cannot process it. And this is really shocking, because I saw the remark that perhaps the conflicts in Africa is not complex enough. In fact, it's much more complex, because there's a multiplicity of actors. Conflicts has been ongoing for decades. There's so many layers. There's a lot of alliances. There's so many challenges. So it's not a lack of not having complexity. At times I've wondered, is there a fatigue? There was a lot of attention on Russia, then came Gaza. Do we have a classification or a conflict fatigue? But then again, we just do not see the situations. If it's not in the Oval Office that there's a quick peace deal, then perhaps there might be a one-day focus on DRC with no follow-up whatsoever. So that is really alarming. I've been thinking about the international community, and I saw that one of my PhD students, Antoni Klopper, is on the call, and he's been wanting answers because he's working on the prevention of genocide, and I don't know the answer for his question, so if anyone has ideas. But what is interesting to me, and perhaps someone else saw this and I just overlooked it, but I haven't seen any sanctions in terms of war sustaining. Whilst we have seen sanctions in the form of tariffs, in terms of India, Russia, but we haven't seen any sanctions, or I haven't, perhaps it's because I don't speak Arabic, against the UAE for sustaining the war in Sudan. So that is not, sanctions can be done bilaterally. So that to me is just something interesting in a world where currently we see tariffs and sanctions, rightfully so, against those who's war sustaining, but I haven't noticed that in terms of any of the conflicts on on my continent and Alsana's continent of Africa. So that was just a final remark from my side.
I don't know if it's not actually a question, but I would attempt to answer this from my point of view. So I'm researching gold, actually. I'm researching gold corporations' involvement in the war in Sudan. So there is a statement that was said by Dr. Yona earlier, that if you track the money, you will know who's complicit in the war. And I added, if you trace the gold, you would know. So when it comes to sanctions, or like monetary sanctions, okay, let me give a reflection of how, like, the Middle East dynamics. Okay, the Gulf countries, UAE and Saudi, they're the Mongols of the Gulf, of the Middle East in general. So I think in simple ways, there is non-Arab country that can stand against UAE in that sense. It's only Saudi, and I think Saudi is playing shy politics with UAE. Currently, what's happening in my field within the gold, so we have South Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, Chad, Central Africa, Somalia, Ethiopia. They're all somehow complicit in the current war, specifically smuggling gold in and out of Sudan to the UAE. So this also gives us an idea of how the power dynamics that are happening. And also, in the past 30 years of al-Bashir ruling, he wasn't doing a very good job maintaining African relations in that sense. Part of it due to the ideology of associating Sudan with more Arabs, with being Arab more than African. So in terms of the geopolitics in the region, we really don't have strong African ties. In fact, in many cases, the government was actually plotting against other African countries. At some point, they tried to kill Mubarak. At some point, they were plotting against Ethiopia. So I think also this is maybe a reason where the African states are hesitant on directly interfering in the Sudan's war. I know the Sudanese people are a bit of disappointed, especially with South Africa's stance in the war, considering the fact that Sudan was one of the first countries that gave Nelson Mandela a nationalship and a passport. So I think I'm trying to de-associate myself of being Sudanese, but like I think there was an expectation that South Africa would also have a strong say about what's happening in Sudan, considering what they did in Gaza. And then again, like human rights shouldn't be divided. And I think you talked about this. You talked about how, and we had a remark from Mary about how African wars are not getting much attention as other wars. I think also the truth is part of it, the color of the race plays. This is just the truth of it. It plays a huge part of this. The race, maybe also the religion. So I think, and this is actually what makes the situation of Sudan is more complicated. For me personally, I think not as Sudanese, as just a legal student, a student of law, I think it's one of the most complicated situations of conflicts. I don't have anything else to say other than I'm very, very grateful for you agreeing to do this webinar. I really enjoyed the discussion and I learned a lot from all of you. Thank you very, very much. And it was very nice seeing you all. And I would also like to thank our audience for attending the webinar. And I think an action point from this, if none of us can do anything about it, but let's talk about it. And I'm pleading this to you, not just as a student of law, like I said, or like a legal practitioner. I'm saying this as a Sudanese person. We need more people talking about this. And like Mary said, maybe if we're not able to do something on a regional or international level, but just as sharing a post, as simple as sharing a post. Thank you all so much. I hope you have a wonderful weekend and thank you. Bye.
Thank you for having us.
You're very welcome.